Hey out there in comic book land. This is Chuck Dixon with another episode of What You Reading. People ask me all the time, what are you reading when you're not writing or sleeping or doing other activities? So I come here and I tell you what I've been reading. Um, that's about it. Pretty simple, huh? All right, let's get right to it. I have to thank my buddy Drew Geraci for telling me about this collection from Fantagraphics. It's a oversized trade paperback called X Amount of Comics. It's by Don Simpson, and it's got a peculiar history, and everything about it is peculiar, but in a very good way. And I'm so glad Drew told me about it. I completely missed this one in the solicitations, as so often happens. If you don't know about Don Simpson created a comic in the 80s called Megaton Man, which was a parody on the superhero genre. This is before The Tick or any of the other parodies came out. And I followed this comic book religiously. It was just the strangest, oddest book. It went beyond parody. It was a parody with a heart and edge, and just spectacularly funny. And he skewered all the tropes and common things about comic books, particularly the superhero genre. And he obviously had great fun making fun of these comics, and I had great fun reading about it. A particular favorite of mine was his concept of an origins bar, where the superheroes would all hang out and drink and retell their origins. But that among many other concepts that Don came up with, that was a brilliant one. Now, a little bit of backstory. In the Image explosion, they managed to lure Alan Moore over to work for them, and he worked with Steve Bissette and Rick Veitch, and I believe Jim Valentino and Don Simpson on what was to be a miniseries, but it was an aborted miniseries. And basically, it was like a love letter, a poison pen letter, whatever, to Marvel's Silver Age comics. I think Alan Moore was having some nostalgic fun writing it, and the other guys were having fun aping the styles of Kirby and Ditko et al. And John Simpson was here to add production value, his terrific lettering, and a lot of inking for the series as well. The problem with the 1963 series is that it never completed. The joke was that the 6 issues were to lead into a 72-page annual, much like the big Fantastic Four and Spider-Man annuals that Marvel published in the 60s. And but it never happened. Moore never wrote it. A lot of theories why. My theory is probably couldn't come up with an ending he liked. Alan Moore, terrific writer, often failed at endings. Like Spike Lee, sometimes Alan Moore needed to go to ending school. And I think that's what happened here. But this collection by Don Simpson explores what might have happened in like the weirdest way imaginable. He basically opens his story, his wild and crazy story, with a bunch of superheroes who are, heroes in search of an ending, in search of a conclusion. They are literally lost in the multiverse and trying to coalesce around something, trying to find a place for themselves, since their annual is never going to happen. It's a parody, and it's fun. It's filled with wordplay and puns and just plain, ardent goofiness, which I love. And Don is so good at just rampant silliness, plus these great Silver Age comic homage / parodies. But there's a little bit of bitterness here too. I think Don was still rankled over having been fired off the 1963 project halfway through for reasons that he felt were unjustified. And listening to his side of the story, I agree with him. And so here he has his revenge on Alan Moore et al. And it's, I don't know, it's just fun stuff. I mean, any book that includes Cowboy Gorilla, I mean, you gotta love it. So it's I'm not going to recommend it to everybody, but if you're into 80s comics and you're especially into Don Simpson and Megaton Man, you really need to check it out. It was a lot of fun. And in the back, Don gives kind of an essay of the history of the 1963 project and why he felt compelled to do this book as well. And I don't know, fun stuff all around. Goofy, silly, fun stuff. Okay, a little more serious. I read this autobiography of William Friedkin. It was largely a biography of him as a creator rather than what he did every day when he wasn't making movies. In fact, the book is about there are a lot of sections where he's not making movies, and he's obviously the most unhappy man on earth. William Friedkin recently passed, sadly, so I wanted to check this out, as well as rewatching a number of his movies. Friedkin, in case you don't know, was broke onto the scene huge after a couple of mixed results. I mean, he made a movie with Sonny and Cher. He made the movie The Boys in the Band. So the night they raided Minsky's, a famous disaster of a movie made in the late 60s. But then he breaks out. He gets to do this, relatively low budget cop thriller. And that's all he ever saw it as a cop thriller, The French Connection. And what he didn't know, and what no one knew, especially 20th Century Fox, was The French Connection was going to do a huge box office worldwide. And it was going to change the face of American crime films specifically, and the American film scene generally. This tough documentary style flick was going to change everything in Hollywood. Now the movie was made for $1.5 million, and Friedkin goes into detail about the difficulties, and it really is amazing when you see what he went through to get this film made, him and producer Phil D'Antonio, and the changes that went through, and the changes in Hollywood that were happening basically under their feet as they were making this movie. One of the things was when they started out, they thought this was going to be a standard police thriller, no big deal, based on a best-selling book by Robin Cook. And Friedkin originally wanted to cast Jackie Gleason because he thought he was authentically New York Irish. Can you imagine French Connection with Jackie Gleason in it? Other names were thrown around, including Jimmy Breslin, the newspaper columnist, until they found out that not only did he not drive a car, did not have a driver's license, he promised his mother on her deathbed he would never drive a car. And of course, the central action piece of The French Connection was always meant to be this incredible car chase. And so Friedkin cast most of the cast without even auditioning. At one point, flying over to France to pick up an actor that he thought he had cast and found out he had gotten the name wrong, and he cast Fernando Rey, a Spanish actor, instead as the French crime lord. and Fernando Rey had to learn some French in order to do the role. And he cast Roy Scheider without an audition. All the other actors primarily were cast without auditions. And then we got to the lead, who was going to play the lead, and Friedkin did not want Gene Hackman. The studio was pushing Gene Hackman on him, and he didn't want him. And in early auditions and early rehearsals, it became clear to Hackman that Friedkin didn't want him. Hackman got very, very sensitive about it, which anybody would. They had to deal with a lot of emotional issues, and it's hard to believe, after seeing the film, after watching the film many, many times over the decades, that anybody but Hackman could have played this role. And yet Friedkin was never happy with Hackman in this role, even after the film was done. He insists in the book that he saved the performance through editing, which I don't quite believe, because the intensity's there with Hackman. But Friedkin said he had to climb a hill and scream and yell to get that level of intensity out of out of Gene Hackman. Which, given that Gene Hackman is one of the greatest American actors ever, it's just beggars belief. But, it was early in Hackman's career. He had never carried a feature film before. Maybe some of that nervousness came off in the takes. Who knows? But end result was they ended up making this terrific movie mostly on the fly. And one of the things that was mostly on the fly was the famous chase. They had no permits. Now, they had to get permits to shoot on the subway. In fact, it involved a bribe of $40,000 to a transit official so they could shoot on the subway. But most of the rest of the time, they shot guerrilla style. The famous scene where Popeye and Frog 1 are going on and off the subway car, the way they got extras was they shot there entirely without permits. They had a couple of the PAs run up on the street and just yell out, "Hey, does anybody want to be in a movie?" And all these people came from the sidewalk and just milled around the subway platform for a couple of hours while they shot that scene. And Friedkin says to this day he can't remember if they ever paid any of them or they just did it because they wanted to be in a movie. So in that scene, all of those extras are real New Yorkers, as are most of the extras in all the other scenes. I'm sure a lot of people in New York ended up in this movie and didn't even realize they were in a movie. The chase scene, in particular, Friedkin spent a lot of time mapping it out with Phil D'Antonio and the stunt drivers. And there's a great story where in the end, in the editing room, he was very unhappy with how the car chase had come out. He felt that it didn't have the intensity that he wanted. And he complained to the stunt driver. And the stunt driver got a little pissy about it. I would too. Hey, I'm doing my best. I'm doing what you asked me to do. And he says, look, you want intensity? You meet me down there tomorrow morning in the prop car. And he said, but you got to ride along with me. So Friedkin, the stunt driver, and a cameraman in the back seat, they get in the prop car, and that stunt driver takes off bat out of hell early on a Sunday morning. And remember, there's no permits. No one knows they're filming a movie. And he just takes off in that car. And Friedkin says he was going to, wet himself from terror. The cameraman managed to hold the camera steady for all of those point of view shots. And they got their chase. That stunt driver brought the intensity, brought it right home to Friedkin, and it all worked. Now, Friedkin's other indelibly classic movie is The Exorcist, and this was pretty much his follow-up to French Connection. After French Connection, he could do no wrong. Hollywood loved him, whereas before they had absolutely no use for him. He won the Best Picture of the Year for French Connection, and he was approached by William Peter Blatty as the only guy that Blatty wanted to have direct The Exorcist. The studios tried to turn him away from Friedkin because Friedkin was trouble. Yeah, he was trouble. You know what he was? He was an assistant creator. He wanted things the way he wanted them. He envisioned how he wanted the movie, and the studios didn't. It's the oldest story in Hollywood. So Blatty and Friedkin formed an alliance and stuck together and got this film made. And of course, it had a much bigger budget than French Connection. It was even a bigger hit. This was an enormous worldwide global phenomenon for the longest time. I remember standing in a cold, snowy, sleeting January night for 3.5 hours to get into the theater to see this, because initially the Warners released it in only like 26 theaters in the whole country. And if you wanted to see this movie, you had to wait in line. And, packed house, standing room only. But anyway, to me, greatest horror movie ever made. There's no even a close second. Scariest horror movie ever made. An American classic beyond just being a genre film. It's an American classic film. It's filled with thought and wit, and it's just so perfectly constructed. And this is a difficult story to tell, but Friedkin goes all in, with Blatty at his side, with the original William Peter Blatty, the original author, at his side, and they go all in on this. And Friedkin fights for every scene. He fights to keep the opening sequence in Iraq when the studio wanted to cut. He fights for everything. And this was a difficult film. This was an edgy, very, very edgy material for an A Hollywood film at the time. But Friedkin brings it off. It's intelligent, and it is scary, and it is suspenseful, and in the end, it's very, very meaningful. Now, recently they restored cuts that Friedkin made to the movie, and many of these cuts were ones that Blatty strongly objected to. And in the book, Friedkin describes how years later he remained friends with Blatty, although the relationship had cooled because Blatty could not understand, he could never understand why Friedkin made those cuts, and I could never understand either once I saw the final completed version. And eventually, Blatty convinced Friedkin, look, just put the cuts back in and watch it with me. And so he did that, and they watched it together. And Friedkin says, I've got to bow to your judgment. You've been right all these years. You've been right all these decades. Those cuts have never should have been made. That those cuts were the heart of the film. Now, some of the cuts you can understand why they made them. The infamous spider walk, which I didn't know till I read the book, was not special effects at all. They had a contortionist actually climb down the stairs backwards. But in order for her to do it, she needed supportive wires. And the problem with the original version in 1973, there was no CGI. There was no way to digitally alter images. The wires were showing, and it looked silly. And it just totally destroyed the feel of the film. Made everything look fake, whereas nothing looked fake in The Exorcist. The effects were seamless. So they cut it. And of course, years later with CGI, they could take out the wires and present the scene as it was originally filmed. And it's very, very effective, and it's very, very disturbing and frightening. I don't know that it was needed in the finished film, but it's certainly welcome back in the complete cut. Now, a scene that was needed in the original film, and the one that Blatty fought hardest about over the years, was a scene that Friedkin had trimmed just before basically their final encounter with the demon Pazuzu and the possessed girl. Father Marin and Father Karras, basically, they're exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. And they're seated on a chair, on the stairs, as you see here, outside the little girl's room. And Karras is, he's been having his moments of doubt. His faith is slipping away. He's not sure they can do this. He asks Marin why. Why would Satan do this? What's the purpose? And Marin gives this marvelous speech, very short, about basically that the demon wishes to reduce us to animals, and make us feel as though we are unworthy of God's love. And that brings so much to the movie. It spells out the meaning of the movie. Now, Friedkin cut it because he thought that was implied. But no, it needed to be said. A character in the movie needed to say that so that we know why we're fighting, why this is happening, and just, brings the whole film into focus. And you can certainly see why Blatty fought for it. And if you ever get a chance to see the more recent edit of The Exorcist, I urge you to do so. Now, Friedkin's his triumvirate, his hat trick of great films, the last one is Sorcerer, a spectacular movie, a remake of the French classic Wages of Fear, which I hate to tell you film aficionados, you hardcore cineasts, Sorcerer is superior film to Wages of Fear. Wages of Fear, very good movie, but Sorcerer is superior. It brings across the theme and the characters more indelibly, more clearly, certainly more dramatically than the original film. Now, this movie cost an absolute fortune to make and made nothing at the box office. An enormous failure that almost ruined two studios because Paramount and Universal teamed up to make this movie because it was going to cost so damn much money, and they had so much faith in Friedkin. But it failed because it came out in 1977, and audiences weren't in the mood for a movie like this anymore. A serious contemplation of human nature and the brutality of man, and all the rest of it. All these deep themes that Friedkin dealt with in an amazing adventure film. But when audiences wanted an adventure in 1977, they went to see Star Wars, and so this movie tanked huge, absolutely huge at the box office, which is a damn shame because it's a wonderful movie. It's beautifully photographed. It's got a terrific cast and just an amazing story, tremendously suspenseful story. And Friedkin got to cast the guy he thought he was going to hire for Frog One to play the hitman in this movie. But yeah, all shot on location in various jungles and all the rest of it. It's just simply a tour de force and an amazing film. It's about four basically guys whose lives are ended. They have nowhere else to go. They end up in the jungles of Nicaragua. And, down on their luck, no money, no prospects, no escape. And they get offered the chance of redemption, of money, if they drive 2 trucks loaded with highly unstable dynamite across the jungle to put out an oil fire. And it sounds like a very simple plot, but boy, from the setups to the resolution to all the middle passage, it's just an amazing, amazing film to watch with terrific performances. Now, along comes Steve McQueen. I got to tell you the Steve McQueen story. Friedkin admits to hubris a lot of times in the book. Says, look, I was just too proud. I was just too full of myself. I made some really stupid mistakes. And the dumbest mistake he ever made, and I think he would admit it if he was sitting here in the room with me today, was Steve McQueen wanted to star in Sorcerer. He loved it. He loved the script. He couldn't wait to get at that truck. And think about it, man. Steve McQueen was the perfect guy for this role. Playing a down on his luck Irish mobster sent away to the jungle to basically rebuild and drive this truck through the jungle. Who else but Steve McQueen? Born to play that role. Would have been awesome. Roy Scheider is fantastic in the finished film, but Steve McQueen, come on. Now, based on Steve McQueen liking it, Marcello Mastroianni, great Italian actor, he agreed to be in it, play the hitman. And Lino Ventura, amazing French actor, is going to play the French accountant in the film. Now, so Friedkin goes to McQueen and says, look, we're going to shoot in Ecuador, probably going to be down there for 3 months. McQueen says, I ain't going to Ecuador. And he goes, I just left my wife for Ally McGraw, and I'm not leaving her alone for 3 months. Hey, how about you write a role for her in Ecuador? Friedkin says, can't do it. There's no role for someone like Ally McGraw in the Ecuador sequences. It's the exact opposite of what we're looking for. Fashion model traipsing around in the mud in the jungle. And so McQueen says, well, make her an associate producer. And he says, no, I can't do that. And then McQueen says, well, why do you got to film in Ecuador? Can't you find the same kind of locations in Mexico? If you shot it in Mexico, I'll do it. I mean, that way I could be home on weekends. Or, she could come down with me. Right? And Friedkin says, no, it's got to be Ecuador. So McQueen says, hey, look, I got to pass. I can't do that. Well, I'd love to make this movie, but I can't do it. And then when Lino Ventura hears McQueen's not going to be in it, there's no more Lino. When Marcello hears McQueen is not going to be in it, there's no more Marcello. And Friedkin realizes, he comes out and says it in the book. He says, well, how stupid was I? He says, McQueen's face on the poster would have been worth $100 million at the box office. The movie would have been a hit if I'd cast McQueen. And he goes, and he says, I feel even stupider because we never did film in Ecuador. We filmed in the Dominican Republic and Mexico and New Mexico. McQueen could have been home for the weekend every weekend if he wanted to. And he could have had Ally McGraw with him. He says, why didn't I do this? All these years later in this autobiography, he's beating himself up over the fact that what he felt was his masterpiece film could have been a box office success if only he hadn't been so proud. So, pretty cool story. And I got to give it Friedkin in this book. He's very, very candid about being a creator. He admits his faults, his flaws. All creators, myself included, we're just very self-centered people. and he fully realizes that. He fully admits it. And it's just a great read. And it's full of like tons of funny stories and tragic stories and just amazing behind the scenes stuff of some of the greatest movies ever made, particularly 3 of the greatest movies ever made. Hey, you like adventure, you like stories, you like all the rest of it. Caravan of the Damned. It's my second Conan novel. It is out now. You can get it at Amazon. You can get it at Barnes & Noble. Or you can go to Arkhaven and you'll get a free PDF file, which means you can read it on your e-reader, your Kindle, your phone, wherever. It's Conan with the wolves of the desert out in the Zuagir. It's, sword fighting and some monsters and, just, Robert E. Howard insanity. And I loved writing it. And as I've said before, the 3rd book is complete and should be out at the beginning of the new year. So that's it for me for Whatcha Readin'. And